What if the person you spent your entire life believing had abandoned you was actually sacrificing everything to protect you in this emotional family story filled with hidden inheritance, long-lost letters, and heartbreaking family secrets? One young woman's life is turned upside down after discovering the truth, buried for decades. Stay until the very end, because the final revelation doesn't just change Sophia's life, it may completely change the way you see your own family, forgiveness, and the people you've misunderstood. If you stop watching now, you'll miss the one secret that changes everything. The first person who ever called me my dear girl had already been dead for 3 months. Even now, I can still feel my hands shaking as I unfolded that yellowed envelope. Inside was an old brass key, wrapped in faded linen, along with a single note written in trembling handwriting. My dear girl, I've waited 14 years for you to come home. I can't wait any longer. Something has been waiting for you inside the workshop. Don't let anyone find it before you do. I stared at those words until they blurred. 14 years. Someone had been waiting for me. For 14 years. No one had ever written to me like that before. No one had ever called me my dear girl. Not my foster parents. Not my caseworkers. Not the dozens of strangers who came and went throughout my childhood. For most of my life, I wasn't someone's daughter. I wasn't someone's granddaughter. I was simply another file in a government cabinet. Another young woman waiting for her name to be called. My name is Sophia Carter, and this is the story of how one forgotten letter shattered everything I believed about my family, and nearly got me killed before I even understood why. If I had ignored that envelope, if I had thrown it away like every other piece of paperwork handed to me that morning, none of what happened afterward would have happened, and the truth my grandfather spent his entire life protecting would have disappeared forever. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The instant oatmeal sitting in front of me had already turned cold. The coffee tasted burnt. Outside the dining hall windows, dirty snow covered the parking lot of the State Transition Center outside Billings, Montana. It was the same breakfast I'd eaten hundreds of times before, except this morning carried a deadline. At 23 years old, I had officially aged out of the foster care system. No ceremony, no celebration, just paperwork, a handshake, and a polite reminder that my bed would belong to someone else by nightfall. Everything I owned fit inside 2 faded duffel bags and 1 weathered backpack. A few thrift store shirts, 3 novels with cracked spines, an old pocket knife, a worn leather wallet holding exactly $48, and 1 photograph, the only photograph I had left of my parents. I'd carried it through 16 years of foster homes until the edges had become soft from being unfolded thousands of times. My mother stood in front of an old ranch house, smiling into the camera as mountain wind lifted her dark hair. My father stood beside her with 1 arm around her shoulders. Behind them stretched endless pine forests beneath snow-covered peaks. I didn't know where that ranch was. I only knew it had disappeared from my life the same night my parents did. They were killed in a highway accident during a winter storm when I was 7 years old. One moment I had a home. The next, I belonged to the state. People always tell foster children that things will get better. Some mean it, some don't. But after enough broken promises, you stop believing all of them. I learned never to unpack my suitcase completely. Never to decorate a bedroom. Never to call any place home. Because sooner or later, someone always told you it was time to leave. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the social worker assigned to my case for nearly 6 years, knocked softly on the office door exactly at 8 o'clock. She looked exhausted. She always did. Helping kids like me leave the system wasn't a job anyone celebrated. "Sophia," she said gently, "before you go, there's one more thing." I expected another stack of forms. Instead, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope with an unfamiliar law firm's return address. "I almost forgot this arrived last week." She handed it to me carefully. It's from Colorado. Colorado. I frowned. I don't know anyone in Colorado. Mrs. Brooks hesitated before answering. I think someone there knew you. My pulse quickened as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter from an attorney informing me that my grandfather, Walter Brooks, had passed away 3 months earlier. I barely remembered him. In fact, I had spent most of my life believing he had abandoned me after my parents died. According to the documents, however, he hadn't forgotten me at all. He had left me everything. A mountain ranch hidden deep in Colorado. Nearly 70 acres of land. A fully equipped woodworking workshop. A savings account large enough to change the course of my life. And one personal letter that, according to his final instructions, could only be opened by me. Nothing made sense. If he had cared, why hadn't he come for me? Why had I spent 16 years believing I had no family left? Why had he waited until after his death to reach out? Those questions followed me every mile of the journey west. But I had no idea that the answers waiting at that abandoned ranch would uncover secrets buried for decades. Or that before I even reached the front door, someone else was already searching for exactly the same thing my grandfather had hidden. And unlike me, they were willing to kill to keep it. Sophia spent the next 3 days driving west with more questions than answers. The farther she traveled from Montana, the more the world around her seemed to change. Endless highways gave way to towering pine forests, frozen rivers, and winding mountain roads swallowed by fresh snow. Every mile carried her farther from the only life she had ever known, and closer to a past she couldn't remember. She stopped twice to reread her grandfather's letter. Each time, the same sentence refused to leave her mind. Don't let anyone find it before you do. What exactly was it? A family heirloom, money, old documents, or something far more important. The attorney hadn't explained. The letter certainly hadn't. By the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, thick snowflakes had begun falling so heavily that the road ahead almost vanished beneath a blanket of white. Her aging pickup truck struggled through the icy curves, its headlights barely cutting through the darkness. The GPS suddenly lost signal. Then, it shut off completely. Sophia tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Please, just a little farther. She whispered the words to herself as much as to the truck. Nearly 20 minutes later, a rusted wooden sign emerged through the storm. Brooks Ridge Ranch. The faded letters were barely readable beneath years of weather and moss. Her heart skipped. She had finally arrived. The narrow dirt road leading to the ranch looked untouched, except for one unsettling detail. Fresh tire tracks. Sophia slowed the truck. The attorney had told her no one had lived here since her grandfather passed away 3 months earlier. So why were there fresh tracks in the snow? She stepped out into the freezing wind. The ranch stood exactly like the photograph she'd carried for 16 years, yet somehow older, lonelier. Snow covered the roof. Broken fence posts leaned toward the ground. The porch creaked beneath every step. Yet something didn't feel abandoned. It felt watched. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Only silent trees stretching endlessly into the darkness. Still, the strange feeling refused to leave. Sophia unlocked the front door with the brass key from the envelope. The lock clicked instantly, almost as if someone had been expecting her. Warm memories she didn't know she still possessed flashed through her mind. A crackling fireplace, a deep laugh, the scent of freshly cut cedar, tiny fragments from a childhood that had nearly disappeared. The air inside carried the smell of old wood, dust, and time itself. Furniture remained exactly where it had been left. Books still lined the shelves. An old rocking chair sat beside the fireplace. On the mantel rested a framed photograph of a little girl sitting on an elderly man's shoulders. Sophia slowly picked it up. The little girl was her She couldn't remember the day the picture had been taken, but tears welled in her eyes anyway. "So, you really did love me?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. For 16 years, she had believed her grandfather had forgotten she existed. Yet every room inside the house told a different story. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been replaced. It was as though he had frozen time, waiting for her return. Then she noticed something else. Every clock inside the house had stopped at exactly 9:17. Kitchen clock, hallway clock, bedroom clock, even the old grandfather clock in the living room. All frozen. 9:17. Coincidence? Or a message? Before she could think further, a loud bang echoed outside. She spun toward the window. A dark SUV rolled slowly past the entrance gate before disappearing behind the trees. Its headlights never turned toward the house. It was almost as if whoever was inside wanted to make sure she knew they were there. Without revealing themselves, Sophia's heartbeat quickened. The ranch wasn't as empty as she'd been led to believe. Someone else knew she had arrived. She quickly locked the front door and pulled every curtain closed. For the first time since opening the mysterious letter, fear outweighed curiosity. Whoever had driven past wasn't lost. They had come here for a reason. And somehow, they already knew she was standing inside the ranch, trying to calm herself. Sophia remembered her grandfather's final words. "Something has been waiting for you inside the workshop." The workshop? She grabbed the old lantern hanging beside the fireplace. Outside, snow continued falling harder than ever. The detached workshop stood nearly 50 yards from the house, hidden behind towering pine trees. As she approached, she noticed the heavy padlock hanging from the wooden door. It had never been forced open. Her grandfather's brass key slid perfectly into the lock. One click! The door slowly creaked inward. Moonlight spilled across rows of forgotten woodworking tools. Everything was covered in dust, except for a single workbench in the center of the room. Someone had cleaned it recently. Sophia froze. She wasn't the first person to come looking. And somewhere, hidden within that silent workshop, was the secret her grandfather had protected for decades. She had no idea that before sunrise, she would uncover the first clue, and that someone watching from the darkness had already decided she would never be allowed to leave the ranch alive. Sophia's flashlight swept slowly across the workshop, revealing rows of hand planes, chisels, saws, and workbenches that had been perfectly arranged decades earlier. Dust blanketed nearly everything inside the building, softening the edges of forgotten tools and half-finished furniture. Nearly everything. The workbench in the center of the room was different. Its surface was spotless. Someone had wiped it clean. Recently, Sophia instinctively stepped backward. Her grandfather had been dead for 3 months. If no one was supposed to have entered the workshop since then, who had cleaned that table? She slowly raised the lantern higher. The silence inside the building became almost unbearable. Every creak of the old wooden floor sounded louder than it should. Even her breathing echoed against the walls. Then she noticed something carved into the edge of the workbench. 3 small words. "Look below me!" The letters had been cut by hand years earlier, almost invisible beneath the wood grain. Her pulse quickened. She crouched beside the heavy table and ran her fingers underneath the frame. Nothing. She searched again. This time her hand brushed against a small metal latch. Click! The center panel beneath the workbench dropped open. Inside rested a narrow cedar box wrapped in faded canvas. Sophia carefully lifted it onto the table. Unlike everything else in the workshop, the box looked untouched by time. Its brass hinges still gleamed. Its lock had never rusted. She unlocked it with the same brass key her grandfather had mailed her. Inside wasn't gold, or cash, or jewelry. Instead, she found dozens of neatly bundled letters. Every bundle carried a different year. Year after year, her hands trembled as she untied the oldest bundle. The first envelope stopped her heart. To my granddaughter Sophia. It had never been mailed. She opened it carefully. If you're reading this, then I failed again. I drove to see you today. They told me foster children aren't allowed visitors without permission. I sat across the street for almost 3 hours, hoping I'd catch one glimpse of you through the playground fence. You looked happy. I didn't want to ruin that. Sophia felt tears burning her eyes. She reached for another letter, then another. Each one described another attempt. Another birthday, another Christmas, another failed visit. Every year, her grandfather had written to her. Every year, he had tried to find a way back into her life. Every year, something had stopped him. The anger she had carried for 16 years began collapsing beneath the weight of the truth. He hadn't abandoned her. Someone had kept them apart. But who? Before she could finish reading another page. Crash! Something slammed violently against the workshop door. Sophia jumped. The lantern nearly slipped from her hands. Silence. Then, 3 slow knocks. Knock. Knock! Knock. Not loud. Not desperate. Deliberate. As though whoever stood outside knew exactly where she was. Sophia. The voice was low. Almost friendly. You don't have to hide. Every muscle in her body froze. She had told no one she was coming. The attorney didn't know when she'd arrive. No one at the transition center knew the address. So how could anyone outside know her name? She quietly extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the workshop. She held her breath. The footsteps outside circled slowly around the building. Crunch. Crunch! Crunch! Snow compressed beneath heavy boots. Then everything stopped. For nearly 2 full minutes. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. No movement. Sophia counted each heartbeat. Finally, she risked looking through a narrow crack between the wooden boards. The yard appeared empty. The SUV was gone. No footprints surrounded the workshop. Whoever had been outside had disappeared almost as mysteriously as they had arrived. She waited another minute before relighting the lantern. Something immediately caught her attention. The workshop door hadn't moved. It was still locked from the inside. No one could have knocked unless they had been standing only inches away. Yet there were no footprints. A chill raced down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. Trying to steady herself, she continued searching through the cedar box. Beneath the letters lay a folded map of the ranch. Most of it looked ordinary until she noticed one location marked with a red circle. There was no label, only a handwritten warning. Never trust the deed. The truth lies beneath the old oak. Folded beside the map was another document. Unlike the handwritten letters, this one had been typed. At the top appeared the name of a company she had never heard before, Summit Ridge Development Corporation. Attached was an unsigned purchase agreement offering millions of dollars for the ranch. Across the front, her grandfather had written one sentence in thick black ink. They don't want the land. They want what's underneath it. Sophia stared at the words, confused. Underneath it. Underneath the ranch. Before she could make sense of the warning, another object slipped from the bottom of the cedar box. It was an old black and white photograph. It showed her grandfather standing beside 3 other people in front of the workshop, nearly 40 years earlier. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then she noticed one face had been violently scratched away with a knife. On the back of the photograph, her grandfather had written only 6 chilling words. Never tell her who betrayed us. Sophia's hands began to shake again. She had come expecting to inherit a forgotten ranch. Instead, she had uncovered evidence that someone had spent decades hiding the truth from her. And somewhere beyond the workshop walls, the person connected to that photograph might still be watching, waiting for her to make the next move. The wind howled outside the workshop as Sophia stood frozen, the old photograph trembling in her hands. She couldn't stop staring at the face that had been scratched away. Who was this person? Why had her grandfather erased them so violently? And what kind of betrayal was terrible enough to haunt a man for 40 years? For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sophia realized she had been asking the wrong questions. She had come here believing this story was about an inheritance. It wasn't. She had believed it was about a lonely old man leaving property to the last surviving member of his family. That wasn't true either. This was about something much older, something people had fought desperately to keep buried. She looked around the silent workshop once more. The carefully organized tools, the spotless workbench, the hidden compartment. The letters. None of it had been left behind by accident. Her grandfather hadn't simply prepared an inheritance. He had prepared her. Every letter, every clue, every warning. They formed a path that only she was meant to follow. Sophia carefully folded the photograph and placed it back inside the cedar box before continuing through the remaining documents. Near the bottom, she discovered a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellow with age, filled with neat handwriting she immediately recognized from the letters. Her grandfather had written almost every day during the final years of his life. Most entries described ordinary ranch work: repairing fences, planting trees, restoring antique furniture. But scattered throughout the journal were sentences that sent chills through her body. I saw the black SUV again today. Someone searched the barn while I was in town. They still believe I never found the second key. If anything happens to me, Sophia must never trust anyone who arrives asking questions about the property. Sophia's breathing slowed. He hadn't imagined someone was watching him. He had known. For years. One page had been folded differently than the rest. Inside, she found a small newspaper clipping dated nearly 15 years earlier. The headline read, "Local businessman dies in hunting accident." Her grandfather had circled the article in red ink. Beneath it, he had written only one sentence. It wasn't an accident. He was about to tell the truth. Sophia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. How many people had become part of this mystery? How many had disappeared before they could speak? She suddenly remembered the black SUV outside. The fresh tire tracks, the mysterious knocks. Those weren't random events. Someone had continued watching the ranch long after her grandfather died. And now, they were watching her. She closed the journal and leaned against the workbench, trying to steady her racing thoughts. For 16 years, she had carried resentment toward a man she barely remembered. She had convinced herself he simply hadn't cared enough to come back. She remembered birthdays spent waiting for someone who never arrived. Christmas mornings hoping there would be one card with a familiar name. Every disappointment had hardened into anger. Every unanswered question had become another reason to believe she had been abandoned. Now those memories looked completely different. What if every absence had been another failed attempt to protect her? What if staying away had been the only way he could keep her alive? The thought hurt more than the years of loneliness ever had. Tears rolled silently down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into the empty workshop. "I was wrong about you." For the first time since childhood, she no longer felt abandoned. She felt loved. Deeply. Quietly. Patiently. Her grandfather had never stopped believing she would return. That realization changed something inside her. She was no longer here because she needed a place to live. She was here because someone had entrusted her with the final chapter of a story they had spent decades protecting. Walking away was no longer an option. No matter how dangerous the truth became, she carefully repacked every letter exactly as she had found them. The journal went into her backpack. So did the photograph and the map, just as she reached for the cedar box. Something caught her eye beneath the workbench. A tiny brass plate had been nailed to one of the legs. She hadn't noticed it before. Years of dust had hidden the engraving. Using her sleeve, she wiped it clean. Only one sentence appeared. "If Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret." She read it. "If Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret." Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she must have found the secret. Sophia has found this, then she m then she already knows enough to be in danger. Her heartbeat stopped. He had written her name. Not my granddaughter. Not the heir. Her name. He had expected this exact moment. Expected her to discover the hidden compartment. Expected her to understand the letters. And expected that once she did, her life would never be the same. A sudden beam of light flashed across the workshop window. Sophia instinctively ducked. Another beam followed. Then another. Vehicle headlights. Not one. Several. She slowly peered through a narrow gap in the wooden wall. 3 dark SUVs were climbing the long road toward the ranch. Unlike the first visitor, these vehicles made no attempt to hide. They were coming straight for the house. And they were coming fast. Sophia glanced at the journal clutched against her chest. For the first time, she understood exactly what her grandfather had been trying to tell her. The inheritance had never been the ranch. The inheritance was the truth. And judging by the vehicles racing through the snow, someone had finally realized she had found it. The roar of engines echoed through the snow-covered valley as 3 black SUVs climbed the narrow road toward the ranch. Their headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the old house like predators circling wounded prey. Sophia's pulse pounded in her ears. There was no time to panic, only time to decide. She looked down at the leather journal pressed tightly against her chest. Every instinct told her to run. But another voice quieter, steadier, reminded her why she had come. Her grandfather hadn't hidden these clues so she could flee. He had hidden them so she could finish what he no longer could. Taking one last look around the workshop, Sophia noticed something she had overlooked before. Hanging on the wall was an old wooden plaque carved in her grandfather's unmistakable style. The strongest oak survives because its roots run deeper than the storm. She smiled through tears. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the frightened little girl abandoned by the world. She felt like someone had finally been trusted with something that mattered. Quickly stuffing the journal, the letters, the map, and the old photograph into her backpack, she scanned the workshop for another way out. Near the back wall stood a towering cabinet filled with lumber. As she moved it aside, she discovered a narrow wooden door almost perfectly concealed behind the shelves. Her grandfather had hidden an escape route. The rusty latch resisted at first, before finally giving way with a loud crack. Behind it stretched a cramped tunnel, reinforced with rough-cut timber. Cold air drifted upward. Sophia grabbed the lantern and stepped inside just as the sound of slamming car doors echoed outside the workshop. Voices. Several of them. They're here. Search every building. She couldn't have gone far. Sophia extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the tunnel. She moved carefully, using one hand against the damp wall to guide herself forward. The passage sloped gently beneath the ranch before opening into a forgotten cellar beneath the old barn. As she climbed the narrow staircase, another surprise awaited her. The cellar wasn't abandoned. Shelves lined the stone walls, filled with carefully labeled boxes. Old ledgers, property records, photographs, newspaper clippings. It looked less like a storage room and more like a private archive. Her grandfather hadn't hidden one secret. He had spent decades preserving an entire history. Sophia opened the nearest box. Inside were dozens of folders marked with names. Some belonged to neighboring ranch owners. Others belonged to local judges, bankers, surveyors, and county officials. One folder immediately caught her attention. Preston Harper. The name appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. She opened the file. Inside were copies of land surveys dating back nearly 30 years. Several signatures had been highlighted in red. Attached to them were handwritten notes. Forged. Witness bribed. Boundary illegally changed. Sophia frowned. The expensive development company mentioned in her grandfather's papers suddenly began making more sense. This wasn't simply about buying ranches. Someone had been stealing them, piece by piece, for decades. Before she could examine the documents further, another object slipped from the folder. A recent photograph. It showed a well-dressed businessman shaking hands with several local officials outside the county courthouse. Standing beside them was the same black SUV she had seen outside the ranch. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't history. This photograph couldn't have been more than a year old. Whatever operation her grandfather had uncovered, it was still active. A folded note clipped to the picture carried only one sentence. "Trust Sheriff Daniel Hayes, if he is still alive." Sophia read it twice. Her grandfather had written dozens of warnings telling her not to trust anyone. Yet this was different. He had named someone specifically, someone he believed might help. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sophia felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe she wasn't completely alone after all. Maybe someone else knew the truth. Maybe someone had been waiting just as long as her grandfather had. She searched the cellar for anything else connected to Sheriff Hayes. Inside another box, she discovered an old portable radio, several topographic maps, emergency supplies, and a sealed envelope labeled in bold handwriting. For Sophia, only when there is no turning back. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside rested a newer letter. The paper looked far less worn than the others. Sophia, if you're reading this, they have already made their move. Don't waste time trying to save the ranch. Land can be replaced. Truth cannot. Take the journal, the letters, and the county files. Find Daniel Hayes. He knows where the final evidence is hidden. The people coming for you believe they are protecting their fortune. In reality, they are protecting a crime that destroyed more families than you can imagine. You are not running away. You are carrying the only proof left. Tears filled Sophia's eyes once again. Even after death, her grandfather was still guiding her, still protecting her, still believing she was capable of finishing what he had started. For years, she had believed her future ended the day she aged out of foster care. Now she realized something extraordinary. Her life hadn't ended. It had finally begun. Outside, voices continued searching the ranch. Flashlights swept across the snow. The men believed they were hunting a frightened young woman with nowhere to go. They had no idea she now carried decades of evidence capable of exposing every lie they had built their empire upon. Sophia zipped her backpack shut and took one final look around the hidden cellar. This place had given her far more than shelter. It had given her purpose. She climbed the wooden stairs leading out of the barn and disappeared into the dense pine forest behind the ranch. The freezing wind bit at her face, but she never looked back. Because somewhere beyond those mountains was Sheriff Daniel Hayes, the only person her grandfather had trusted with the final piece of the truth. And Sophia knew that finding him wasn't just her next destination. It was her only chance to stay alive, and to make sure the sacrifice her grandfather made would never be forgotten. Sophia walked for hours through the snow-covered forest, following the faded trail marked on one of her grandfather's maps. Every gust of icy wind stung her face, but she refused to slow down. The backpack hanging from her shoulders felt heavier with every mile, not because of its weight, but because of what it contained. The journal, the letters, the photographs, the land records. They were no longer just old papers. They were evidence. Evidence that someone had spent decades stealing land, destroying families, and silencing anyone who came too close to the truth. By dawn, Sophia reached a small mountain town nearly 20 miles from the ranch. The streets were quiet, with only a few diners and gas stations beginning to open for the morning. She pulled the hood of her coat lower over her face. If the men from the ranch were looking for her, they would likely search every hotel and every highway leading out of the mountains. She needed to disappear. Inside a small family-owned cafe, the smell of fresh coffee and warm biscuits almost brought her to tears. She hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, An elderly waitress smiled kindly. "You look like you've been walking all night." Sophia forced a tired smile. "I guess it shows." The woman placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her before she had even ordered. "First cup's on the house." For a brief moment, the simple act of kindness reminded Sophia that not everyone in the world wanted something from her. Some people were simply good. While warming her hands around the mug, she unfolded the note her grandfather had left. "Trust Sheriff Daniel Hayes, if he is still alive." She asked the waitress quietly, "Do you know Sheriff Hayes?" The woman's smile disappeared. "You mean retired Sheriff Hayes?" Sophia nodded. The waitress leaned closer. "He hasn't been sheriff for years." "What happened?" "They said he retired after an injury." She hesitated. "But around here, people tell a different story." Sophia felt her heartbeat quicken. "Oh, what story?" "They say he started asking too many questions about land sales around these mountains. And then, one day he resigned. Just like that?" The waitress lowered her voice even further. "People who ask dangerous questions around here usually stop asking." Before Sophia could say another word, the bell above the cafe door rang. 3 men wearing expensive winter jackets walked inside. None of them ordered food. Instead, they quietly scanned every face in the room. Sophia immediately looked down into her coffee. "Don't look at them! Don't panic!" One of the men pulled a photograph from his pocket. He showed it to the cashier. "Have you seen this woman?" Sophia's blood ran cold. It was her driver's license photo. "How did they already have it?" The cashier studied the picture before shaking his head. "No." The men separated. One moved toward the restrooms. Another walked past the booths. The third remained near the entrance, blocking the exit. Sophia realized they weren't simply searching. They were trapping anyone who tried to leave. She quietly slipped her grandfather's journal deeper into her backpack. Running through the front door would only confirm who she was. Instead, she noticed a narrow hallway leading towards the kitchen. The elderly waitress caught her eye. Without saying a word, the woman understood. She casually picked up an empty coffee pot and walked toward Sophia's table. Then she whispered only 4 words. "Back door! Hurry!" Sophia stood naturally, pretending to follow the waitress for a refill. The moment they disappeared into the kitchen, the older woman pointed toward a delivery entrance. "They'll see you if you use the parking lot." "Then where?" "There's a footbridge behind the building." Sophia hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" The waitress smiled sadly. "Because 30 years ago, someone helped my daughter when nobody else would. Now go." Sophia didn't waste another second. She slipped outside just as angry voices erupted inside the cafe. "She's gone. Search outside." Sophia sprinted across the narrow wooden bridge spanning a frozen creek. Branches slapped against her coat as she disappeared into another stretch of forest. Behind her, men shouted directions. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. The chase had begun. For nearly an hour, she climbed through steep hills until the sounds finally faded. Completely exhausted, she collapsed beside a massive fallen pine tree. As she caught her breath, she opened the journal once more. Something she had overlooked before slipped from between 2 pages. It was a folded photograph. Unlike the others, this one showed her grandfather standing beside a younger man wearing a sheriff's uniform. Written across the back were the words, "Daniel never gave up. Neither should you." Sophia smiled despite the fear surrounding her. For the first time in her life, she understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to move forward even while fear walked beside you. The frightened little girl who had spent 16 years believing she had been abandoned was gone. The young woman hiding in the mountains now understood that she carried something far greater than her own future. She carried justice for families who had lost everything. She carried the final promise of a grandfather who had never stopped loving her. Most importantly, she finally carried a reason to believe in herself. Instead of asking, Why did this happen to me? She found herself asking a different question. How many innocent people are still waiting for the truth? That single change transformed everything. She was no longer running because she was afraid. She was moving because someone had to finish what her grandfather had started. As the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, lighting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold, Sophia stood up, adjusted the backpack on her shoulders, and looked toward the small valley marked on the map. According to her grandfather's notes, Daniel Hayes lived alone in an old cabin less than 5 miles away. It was the first real destination she had ever chosen for herself. She took a deep breath and started walking. She didn't know whether the retired sheriff would become an ally, another disappointment, or the next target of the people hunting her. But one thing had become crystal clear. The frightened foster child who had arrived at the ranch no longer existed. In her place stood a determined young woman who finally understood that the greatest inheritance her grandfather had left behind was not the land. It was the courage to stand for the truth, no matter how powerful the people trying to bury it. Sophia followed the winding trail until dusk painted the mountains in shades of amber and blue. According to the map, Sheriff Daniel Hayes's cabin should have appeared just beyond the next ridge. Instead, she found smoke, not the comforting smoke of a fireplace. The thick, black smoke of a burning building. Her heart lurched. She broke into a run. As she reached the clearing, the small log cabin stood engulfed in flames. Firefighters had not arrived. There were no police vehicles. Only one pickup truck parked crookedly beside the porch, and an elderly man desperately trying to control the fire with a garden hose. Sophia rushed toward him. "Are you Sheriff Hayes?" The man turned, his face streaked with soot. "I was once." His eyes narrowed the moment he noticed the backpack. Then they settled on the old leather journal sticking out of the partially open zipper. His expression changed instantly. "Where did you get that?" "My grandfather, Walter Brooks." The retired sheriff closed his eyes for a long moment. "I prayed you would never have to carry that journal." Sophia's voice trembled. "He trusted you." Daniel nodded slowly. "And I failed him." He looked toward the burning cabin. "They came an hour before you did. They searched everything. They knew you were coming." Sophia felt her stomach sink. Were they looking for the evidence? "They found some of it," Daniel answered quietly. "But not the most important part." He reached inside his coat and removed a small metal tin that had clearly survived years of use. Inside rested a single flash drive. Walter had written one sentence across the lid years earlier. "The last truth." Daniel handed it to Sophia. "Everything your grandfather couldn't prove on paper is here. Financial records, recorded conversations, property transfers, names, every person involved." Sophia stared silently. One small flash drive, decades of truth. Daniel smiled faintly. "Walter always said paper can burn. Untom, but truth survives if enough people carry it." At that exact moment, the distant roar of engines echoed through the valley. Daniel looked toward the road. "They found us." 3 black SUVs emerged from the trees. Then a 4th. Then a 5th. There would be no running this time. The vehicles surrounded the clearing. Several men stepped out. Their expensive coats and polished boots looked strangely out of place against the snow-covered mountains. One man walked forward confidently. Silver hair. Tailored overcoat. Perfect smile. "Miss Carter." His voice was calm. "I've been hoping we'd finally meet." Sophia said nothing. "My name is Preston Harper. The ranch belongs to my company." "It always has." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Liar." Preston ignored him. He focused entirely on Sophia. "You've been told a very emotional story. Old letters. Family secrets. Conspiracy theories. But you're young. You still have time to make the right decision." He slowly removed a folder from his briefcase. Inside was a check. $5 million. "Hand me the journal." The flash drive. And every document you found? You'll never have to worry about money again. Sophia looked at the check. Just days earlier, she had owned $48. She had no home, no career, no certainty about tomorrow. $5 million could erase every hardship she had ever known. Preston smiled. I can see you're thinking. Daniel quietly whispered beside her. So was everyone else? Aban, before they accepted. Silence filled the clearing. Snow drifted softly between them. Sophia thought about every foster home, every birthday spent alone, every night wondering why no one had come for her. She thought about the letters her grandfather had written every single year. She thought about the waitress who risked helping a stranger. She thought about Daniel standing beside a burning cabin because he refused to surrender. Then she remembered something carved into the workshop wall. The strongest oak survives because its roots run deeper than the storm. Sophia looked directly into Preston's eyes. You still don't understand. He frowned. What don't I understand? You think this story is about land? She slowly removed the flash drive from the metal tin. No. You think it's about money? She shook her head. No. You think my grandfather spent 40 years protecting property? Again. No. Her voice grew stronger with every word. He spent 40 years protecting people. And today, I'm trying Tom. Homtit. Spos, I'm choosing them. Without another word. Sophia reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She pressed one button. Preston's confident smile disappeared. What did you do? I started a live broadcast. She turned the screen toward him. Thousands of viewers were already watching. Earlier that morning, Daniel had quietly shown her how to connect the flash drive to a satellite transmitter hidden beneath the cabin floor. Every document, every recording, every confession, every financial record. They had already begun uploading automatically to journalists, federal investigators, and multiple news organizations across the country. Preston lunged forward. Take her phone. Too late. Daniel smiled for the first time. Walter planned for this 20 years ago. Police sirens echoed through the valley. Not local deputies. Federal agents. Several black government SUVs raced up the mountain road from the opposite direction. Preston looked around desperately. His own men began backing away. Within minutes, handcuffs replaced expensive watches. Search warrants replaced threats. Everything Walter Brooks had protected for decades finally reached the people capable of acting on it. Months later, the investigation exposed one of the largest land fraud schemes in the state's history. Dozens of families recovered property that had been stolen through forged deeds. Corrupt officials were removed from office. Executives who believed they were untouchable faced justice instead. As for Sophia, she returned to the ranch, not because she wanted to hide from the world, but because she wanted to build something her grandfather would have been proud to see. The old workshop echoed with life once again. Children from foster care learned woodworking where fear had once lived. Families gathered around long wooden tables built by hands that had finally found purpose. The ranch became more than a home. It became proof that broken beginnings do not determine how a story ends. Every year, on the anniversary of her grandfather's passing, Sophia unlocked the same cedar box hidden beneath the workbench. She reread the first letter. My dear girl, I've waited 14 years for you to come home. She smiled every single time, because she finally understood. He had never been waiting for her to inherit the ranch. He had been waiting for her to discover who she was truly meant to become. And in choosing truth over fear, Sophia hadn't just fulfilled her grandfather's final wish. She had become the kind of person whose courage would inspire generations long after both of them were gone. Every one of us carries a story that no one else can fully see. Sometimes we spend years believing we know why someone left us, why they never called, why they never came back. We replay those painful memories over and over until they become our truth. But what if the truth we've been holding on to isn't the whole story, Sophia spent 16 years believing she had been forgotten. Every birthday without a phone call. Every Christmas without a hug. Every lonely night convinced her of one heartbreaking lie that she simply wasn't worth fighting for. But hidden inside a weathered cedar box were letters that changed everything. Letters written by a grandfather who had never stopped loving her. Letters filled with birthday wishes he could never deliver. Christmas messages she never received. Words of encouragement she was never allowed to hear. In a single moment, the pain she had carried for years was transformed into something entirely different. Not abandonment, but sacrifice. Not rejection, but protection. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. Life isn't always divided into heroes and villains. Sometimes good people make impossible choices. Sometimes love is silent because speaking would put someone else in danger. Sometimes the deepest love isn't the one that stays beside us. It's the one that quietly protects us from the shadows, asking for nothing in return. Sophia also discovered that the greatest inheritance isn't measured in dollars, land, or possessions. Money can disappear. Homes can burn. Property can be taken away. But courage, integrity, compassion, and the strength to stand for what is right, those are treasures that no one can ever steal. Walter Brooks didn't leave his granddaughter a fortune. He left her something far more valuable. The courage to face the truth, the strength to forgive, and the determination to become the kind of person who changes the lives of others. Maybe that's what truly defines a successful life. Not how much we accumulate, but how much hope we leave behind. Not how loudly people remember our names, but how deeply they remember our kindness. Because in the end, people may forget what we owned. They may forget what we accomplished, but they will never forget how we made them feel. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. Is there someone you've been silently missing? Someone you've been angry with for years? Someone you wish you could talk to one more time? If this story has touched your heart, don't wait for tomorrow to tell someone you love them. Don't let pride steal moments you'll never get back. Forgive if you can. Call someone you've been thinking about. Write the message you've been putting off. Life is more fragile than we realize, and sometimes one conversation can heal wounds that have lasted a lifetime. If Sophia's journey moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next inspiring story. And most importantly, share your own story in the comments below. Have you ever discovered a truth that completely changed the way you saw someone you loved? Or is there someone you wish you had one more chance to thank or to forgive? Your story may become the light that helps another person find hope today. Remember this: the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't the wealth in our hands. It's the love in our hearts, the courage in our choices, and the lives we change long after we're gone.